We know Columbus as an explorer, a discoverer. What we don't talk about is what happened after the ships landed. When the Spanish stepped onto Taíno's shores, the real nightmare began. Not for Columbus and his men, their suffering was minimal. For the Taíno people, for every indigenous soul who welcomed these strangers with hospitality, what came next was worse than any war they'd ever known. You think you know about Columbus? The textbooks don't tell you what happened after first contact. If you value documented historical truth like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support this work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. This script is researched and factual using sources from Bartolomé de las Casas' eyewitness accounts, Spanish colonial records, and archaeological evidence from Hispaniola. Now, back to the story. October 12, 1492. Columbus lands on Guanahani in the Bahamas. The Taíno people greet him with gifts and kindness. Columbus writes in his journal how gentle and generous they are, how they'd make excellent servants. Within days, he's taken captives. Not prisoners of war, the Taíno weren't at war with Spain. They were inventory, human cargo for a new kind of economy. Columbus's own journals reveal his intentions from day one. He wrote to the Spanish monarchs that with 50 men, he could subjugate the entire population and make them do whatever he wanted. These weren't battlefield tactics. This was a business plan. The Taíno had value, not as people, as resources to be extracted, like gold or timber. But here's what the celebration of Columbus Day won't tell you. The gold quotas started immediately. Every Taíno over age 14 had to deliver a hawk's bell full of gold dust every 3 months. Those who succeeded received copper tokens to wear around their necks. Those who failed had their hands cut off. Then they were left to bleed to death. This wasn't punishment for rebellion. This was policy, standard operating procedure. Archaeological evidence from Hispaniola tells the rest. Mass graves dated to 1495-1500 show systematic execution patterns. Skull trauma consistent with Spanish weaponry. Defensive wounds proving these weren't warriors. These were farmers, craftspeople, families. The bones don't lie about what happened when the gold ran out. The Taíno population on Hispaniola before Columbus arrived is estimated between 250,000 and 8 million people. By 1516, just 24 years later, only 12,000 remained. By 1542, just 200. By 1555, 0. An entire people erased in 2 generations. That's not conquest, that's extermination. But forced labor wasn't the worst of it. Columbus didn't just enslave Taíno men, he sold them. In 1495, he shipped 500 Taíno people back to Spain as slaves. They were packed into ships like cargo. Half died during the voyage. The survivors were sold in European slave markets. Columbus sent more slaves across the Atlantic than any individual of his time. Not accidentally. Not as a side effect of colonization. This was the entire point. The Encomienda system formalized what Columbus started. Spanish colonists received royal land grants that included every indigenous person living on that land. Not as tenants, as property. The encomendero, the grant holder, could force them into mines, plantations, or domestic service. He could demand tribute. He could sexually exploit the women. He could sell them to other Spaniards. The system was legally sanctioned slavery disguised as Christian charity. The official justification? The Spanish were teaching the natives Christianity and protecting them from warfare. The reality was genocide by labor. Economic historian Timothy Yeager called the Encomienda deadlier than conventional slavery because individual laborers were disposable. If one died, another from the same land grant replaced them. There was no incentive to keep anyone alive. Bartolomé de las Casas witnessed it firsthand. As a young encomendero himself, he participated in slave raids against the Taíno. He watched Spanish soldiers cut down entire villages. He saw the torture, the mutilations, the executions. He later wrote that he witnessed cruelty on a scale no living being has ever seen or expects to see. One specific incident broke him: the massacre at Jaragua in 1503. Taíno Queen Anacaona invited the Spanish governor, Nicolas de Ovando, to celebrate at her home. She gathered local leaders for a feast, a gesture of diplomacy. Ovando arrived with 300 soldiers and 70 horsemen. During the celebration, Spanish troops blocked all exits and drew their swords. They bound 80 Taíno leaders and set fire to the building with everyone inside. Those who escaped the flames were hunted down. Locals who attended the celebration were disemboweled, impaled, dismembered. Las Casas recorded children being thrown from horses and impaled by Spanish cavalry. When children fell, soldiers held them down and cut off their legs. Anacaona herself was either hanged immediately or taken to Santo Domingo, where some accounts say she was tortured for 3 months before execution. This wasn't a battle. It was a massacre designed to break indigenous resistance through terror. The Spanish didn't just kill Taíno men, they targeted women specifically. Sex slavery became standard practice. Columbus himself wrote about the slave trade in young girls, noting that children aged 9 or 10 were in high demand. He recorded prices casually, like livestock. A young woman sold for the same price as farmland. Native women were valued 50 to 60% higher than men in slave markets. Historian Andrés Reséndez documented why: sexual exploitation and reproductive capacity. Spanish colonists wanted women they could rape and breed. The children born from forced unions were considered property of the father, born into slavery if the mother was enslaved. Archaeological evidence from Spanish colonial sites reveals the infrastructure: holding cells in castle, courtyards specifically designed for women, stone walls, iron doors, no windows. Some held 30 people at a time. Bone analysis from refuse pits shows infant mortality rates near 100%. These weren't stillbirths. These were murders. The mixed-race children of rape were evidence the Spanish wanted erased. The Encomienda granted encomenderos absolute power over indigenous women. The system was designed for sexual exploitation. Hernán Cortés received an encomienda with 115,000 indigenous people. His power over them was practically unlimited, including sexual access to women. This wasn't a violation of the system. It was the system working exactly as designed. If you value documented historical truth like this, subscribe. It's the best way to support this work. Also, comment from which city you're hearing this from. Now, back to the story. The tribute system killed through impossible quotas. When Taíno couldn't deliver enough gold because there simply wasn't enough, the Spanish escalated. They didn't reduce quotas. They increased violence. Cacique Caonabo, a Taíno leader in Maguana, planned resistance. Columbus sent 400 men into the interior to terrorize the population before any attack could be organized. This became the pattern: preemptive massacres to prevent rebellion. Spanish soldiers would raid villages, kill the men, rape the women, and burn crops. Starvation followed. The Taíno had been self-sufficient farmers. Spanish livestock destroyed their fields. Spanish tribute demands left no time to plant. Entire communities starved while mining gold for people who would kill them anyway. The death spiral was intentional. Spanish colonists stole food from indigenous stores, worsening famine. When caciques refused to pay tribute in protest, the Spanish captured and executed them publicly. The message was clear. Resistance meant death. Compliance meant slower death. But disease did what even Spanish brutality couldn't fully accomplish. Smallpox arrived in 1518. The Taíno had no immunity to European diseases: smallpox, typhus, influenza. Entire villages died in weeks. Some historians claim disease was the primary killer, that Spanish violence was secondary. But that ignores the archaeological record. Mass graves from 1492, 1518 show trauma patterns inconsistent with disease. These people died violently before smallpox arrived. Disease devastated a population already decimated by slavery, overwork, and starvation. A healthy population recovers from epidemics, as Europeans did after the Black Death. The Taíno didn't recover because there was nothing to recover to. The Spanish had destroyed their food systems, enslaved their labor, and killed their leaders. Disease just finished what Spanish colonization started. The brutality wasn't random cruelty, it was economic policy. When Columbus returned to Spain, he needed to prove the expedition was profitable. There was less gold than he'd promised, so he shipped people instead. Humans became the commodity that justified continued colonization. Colonial records show the expansion of slave infrastructure. By 1502, the Encomienda system was formalized. Every Spanish settlement had holding facilities for indigenous captives. Every port had processing centers. The logistics were sophisticated. This wasn't improvised violence. This was industrial-scale human trafficking. The Catholic Church blessed it. Priests accompanied conquistadors to convert the natives. But conversion meant forced baptism followed by enslavement. Papal decrees in 1493 explicitly authorized Spain to claim new territories and subjugate their inhabitants. The justification was spreading Christianity. The result was genocide. Some Spanish voices opposed it. Dominican friars in Santo Domingo, led by Pedro de Córdoba, arrived in 1510 and were horrified. They preached against Spanish brutality, arguing that natives were human beings with souls. Colonial authorities complained to the Spanish crown. The Dominicans were recalled. Bartolomé de las Casas became their greatest advocate after his own conversion. In 1514, preparing a sermon, he read from the Book of Sirach, "Whoever deprives the poor of their living murders them. To deprive an employee of wages is to shed blood." He recognized himself in those words. He freed his own slaves and spent the next 50 years fighting Spanish colonialism. His most famous work, a short account of the destruction of the Indies, cataloged the atrocities. Published in 1552, it described in graphic detail how Spanish colonists massacred entire populations. Las Casas didn't exaggerate. Contemporary records confirm his accounts. He wrote, "The cruelty is so terrible that it beggars the imagination. These poor people would fare better if entrusted to devils in hell than to the devils of the New World who masquerade as Christians." The Spanish monarchy eventually responded, not to stop the violence, but to regulate it. The new laws of 1542 officially prohibited enslavement of indigenous peoples. In practice, nothing changed. Colonial authorities simply refused to enforce the laws. Encomenderos revolted when Bartolomé de las Casas tried to implement them as Bishop of Chiapas. The Spanish crown backed down. Profit mattered more than indigenous lives. The Encomienda system persisted for centuries. It spread beyond the Caribbean to Mexico, Central America, and South America. Everywhere the Spanish went, the same pattern followed. Forced conversion, land seizure, mass slavery, sexual violence, and depopulation. The conquest of the Aztec Empire by Hernán Cortés in 1519 followed Columbus's blueprint. Francisco Pizarro's destruction of the Inca Empire used identical methods. The broader impact was catastrophic. Scholars estimate that 90% of indigenous Americans died within a century of Columbus's arrival. That's between 50 and 100 million people, the largest population collapse in human history. Some died from disease, but millions died from slavery, massacre, overwork, and starvation. This wasn't an unfortunate byproduct of contact. This was colonization working exactly as designed. Modern historians use terms like genocide and ecocide, the deliberate destruction of entire peoples and their ways of life. The depopulation was so severe it caused global climate change. When millions of indigenous farmers died or were enslaved, their agricultural lands reverted to forest. The CO2 absorption was measurable in ice core samples. Scientists call it the Great Dying. The indigenous population didn't recover for centuries. Only in the 20th century did Native American populations begin approaching pre-Columbian numbers. The cultural loss is incalculable. Languages, technologies, knowledge systems, all destroyed. What survived despite everything the Spanish did to erase it. So why do we still celebrate Columbus? Because for centuries, his story was told by the victors. Italian-American communities embraced him as a symbol of heritage and achievement. School textbooks praised him as a heroic explorer. The violence was minimized, rationalized, or erased entirely. That narrative is finally changing. Cities and states across the U.S. now recognize Indigenous Peoples Day instead of Columbus Day. The shift acknowledges what historians have always known. Columbus didn't discover anything. He invaded. He colonized. He enslaved. He set the template for centuries of genocide. The Taíno people aren't extinct. Despite everything, descendants survive. Modern DNA studies show Taíno ancestry persists in Caribbean populations, particularly in Puerto Rico and the Dominican Republic. Cultural practices, words, and traditions endure. The erasure wasn't complete, but the cost was staggering. When Columbus landed in 1492, the Americas were home to thriving civilizations with populations in the tens of millions. By 1600, most were gone. Not because they were inferior, not because contact was inevitable, because European colonizers built empires on their bodies. Recent excavations continue uncovering evidence. Mass graves, execution sites, slave quarters, the physical remains of systematic violence. Each discovery confirms what indigenous oral histories have always maintained. The colonization of the Americas was genocide on a scale almost incomprehensible. But some Taíno refused to accept their fate quietly. Cacique Enriquillo became a symbol of indigenous resistance. Raised by Franciscan monks, educated in Spanish customs, he initially tried to work within the colonial system. When a Spanish encomendero raped his wife and stole his horse, Enriquillo sought justice through Spanish courts. He was ignored, so he chose war. In 1519, Enriquillo led a rebellion that lasted 14 years. He established a fortified community in the Baharuco mountains of Hispaniola. Spanish forces sent expedition after expedition to crush him. All failed. Enriquillo knew Spanish tactics. He'd studied their weaknesses. He used guerrilla warfare, hit and run attacks, ambushes, strategic retreats into terrain Spanish cavalry couldn't navigate. His rebellion freed hundreds of enslaved Taíno and some African slaves who joined his cause. Colonial records show Spanish authorities were terrified, not just of Enriquillo's military success, but of what it represented. Proof that indigenous people could effectively resist. Proof that Spanish dominance wasn't inevitable. The Spanish crown eventually negotiated a truce. In 1533, they promised Enriquillo and his followers freedom and land. For once, they kept their word. partly because Enriquillo had made continued war too expensive. He died a free man, but his victory was individual, not collective. The broader Taíno population continued to suffer and decline. Other forms of resistance were more desperate. Mass suicide became common. Las Casas recorded Taíno mothers killing their own children rather than let them grow up enslaved. Entire families ingested cassava poison together. These weren't acts of weakness, they were acts of agency, the last choice available to people with no choices left. Spanish authorities viewed indigenous suicide as theft. Dead slaves couldn't work. Colonial records show encomenderos demanding compensation when their property chose death over enslavement. The Spanish crown issued decrees against indigenous suicide, as if legislation could overcome despair. The violence created a labor crisis. Indigenous populations collapsed so quickly that Spanish colonists couldn't maintain plantations and mines. Their solution? Import African slaves. This is rarely discussed in Columbus narratives, but it's essential context. The transatlantic African slave trade emerged directly from the indigenous genocide in the Americas. Las Casas himself initially suggested importing African slaves to spare indigenous peoples. He later renounced this position and condemned all slavery, but the damage was done. By the 1520s, enslaved Africans were arriving in the Caribbean. Over the next 3 centuries, an estimated 12.5 million Africans were forcibly transported to the Americas. The indigenous genocide enabled African enslavement. The economic model Columbus established, extract maximum value through enslaved labor, became the foundation of European colonial empires worldwide. From the Caribbean to Mexico, from Peru to Brazil, from North America to the Philippines, the same pattern repeated. Colonize, enslave, extract, exterminate. The profits built European economies. The cost was measured in tens of millions of dead. Spanish colonial records show systematic planning. Official correspondence between colonial governors and the Spanish crown discusses indigenous populations as economic resources. How many laborers does this mine require? How quickly are they dying? Should we import more from neighboring islands? These weren't moral questions. They were logistics problems. The Encomienda system was eventually replaced by the hacienda system, then by wage labor. But the fundamental relationship remained. European owners, indigenous and African workers, extraction of wealth through violence. This economic structure persisted through independence movements, through the formation of new nation-states, into the modern era. The psychological impact was devastating. Spanish colonizers deliberately destroyed indigenous culture to break resistance. They burned codices, books containing indigenous history, science, and astronomy. They banned traditional ceremonies and religious practices. They forced conversions to Christianity at sword point, baptism or death. Children were taken from families and placed in Spanish-run schools. The explicit goal was to erase indigenous identity, teach them Spanish, teach them Christianity, teach them to be ashamed of their heritage. This cultural genocide accompanied the physical genocide. It wasn't enough to kill indigenous people's bodies. The Spanish wanted to kill their spirits too. Archaeological evidence shows how thorough this destruction was. Pre-Columbian sites reveal sophisticated civilizations with advanced agriculture, astronomy, mathematics, and architecture. Post-contact sites show abandonment and destruction. The knowledge systems that had developed over millennia were deliberately dismantled. Some knowledge survived through oral tradition, passed down secretly despite Spanish prohibition. Some was preserved by indigenous and mestizo chroniclers who wrote in Spanish to document what was being lost. But vast amounts simply vanished. We'll never know what was in those burned codices. We'll never recover those lost languages and technologies. The Spanish justified this destruction through a doctrine of racial and religious superiority. Indigenous peoples were savages who needed civilization. This wasn't true. Spanish colonizers encountered complex societies with sophisticated governance, art, and science. But calling them savages made genocide easier to rationalize. This justification created lasting damage. Even after independence movements ended Spanish colonial rule, the ideologies persisted. Indigenous peoples throughout the Americas continued to face discrimination, land theft, and violence. They still do. The attitudes that enabled Columbus's actions didn't end with Spanish colonialism. They evolved into new forms of oppression. Modern genetics reveals the scale of sexual violence. DNA studies of Caribbean and Latin American populations show patterns consistent with mass rape. Indigenous maternal lineages are common. European paternal lineages are dominant. This pattern appears across the Americas. Proof that colonization involved systematic sexual assault of indigenous women. The children born from this violence faced impossible situations. Mestizos, people of mixed indigenous and European ancestry, occupied an ambiguous social position. Too indigenous for Spanish society, too Spanish for indigenous communities. Colonial authorities created elaborate racial classification systems. Mestizo, mulatto, zombo, dozens of categories defining exactly how much indigenous, African, or European ancestry someone had. These classifications determined legal rights, economic opportunities, social status. They also served colonial power by dividing oppressed peoples against each other. Mestizos might have slightly better status than full-blooded indigenous people. This created incentives to identify with Spanish culture, to distance oneself from indigenous heritage. Another form of cultural genocide. The casta system, as it was called, persisted long after colonial rule ended. Modern Latin American societies still grapple with colorism and discrimination based on perceived ancestry. The social hierarchies Columbus and his successors created have lasted over 500 years. Recent historical scholarship has worked to recover silenced voices. Indigenous accounts of the conquest exist, written in Nahuatl, Maya, Quechua, and other languages. The Florentine Codex, compiled by Friar Bernardino de Sahagún with indigenous informants, preserves Aztec perspectives on Spanish conquest. These accounts describe the violence from the victim's viewpoint, something European histories ignored. Reading these accounts is devastating. They describe the terror of facing Spanish weaponry, guns, cannons, metal armor against cloth and wood. They describe watching family members killed, watching sacred sites destroyed, watching their world end. One Nahuatl poem reads, "Broken spears lie in the roads. We have torn our hair in grief. The houses are roofless now, and their walls are red with blood." These indigenous chroniclers also documented resistance and survival. They recorded the names of leaders who fought back, the strategies used, the small victories amid overwhelming defeat. They preserved knowledge the Spanish tried to erase. Their work is an act of resistance, proof that indigenous peoples never accepted colonization as inevitable or just. Modern indigenous communities throughout the Americas maintain living connections to pre-Columbian traditions. Languages, ceremonies, agricultural practices, art forms, all survived despite centuries of suppression. This survival is testament to indigenous resilience, to the refusal to be erased. The horror wasn't just what happened, it's that we renamed it. called it discovery, called it civilization, called it progress, as if erasing millions of people was the price of building the modern world. It wasn't. It was a choice. The Spanish chose profit over humanity. They chose empire over coexistence. They chose violence over peace. And for centuries, history books chose to look away. Not anymore. The bones speak. The archives reveal. The descendants remember. The true story of what happened when Columbus arrived isn't about bravery or adventure. It's about what happens when people stop seeing other people as human. That's the real legacy of 1492. Not discovery, destruction. If this forgotten history moved you, subscribe. Every subscription helps us unearth the next buried truth and fight historical erasure. We refuse to let their voices fade into the dust.